My name is Isabel Izzy Davenport. At 24 years old, I stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, a mannequin in a wedding dress that cost more than the average American home. In less than an hour, I was to be married to Alistair Sterling, a reclusive billionaire more than twice my age, a man I barely knew. For my parents, Eleanor and Richard Davenport, this was not a wedding. It was the closing of the most significant business deal of their lives. This day was the culmination of years of meticulous planning, the transaction that would save our family's name from the quiet decay of financial ruin and catapult them back to the apex of society. They were already celebrating the 9-figure payout they had so carefully negotiated. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom in their world of brand names and bottom lines, was that the true nature of this arrangement was hidden in plain sight. It was contained within a single, elegant addendum to the marriage contract, a document I was required to sign only after the ceremony was complete. They saw it as a minor eccentricity. In reality, it was a time bomb set to detonate their greed-fueled dreams. They believed they were selling their daughter for a fortune. They were about to discover, in front of the most powerful people they knew, that they had been ruthlessly played from the very beginning. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to see how my parents' desperate, greedy scheme spectacularly backfired, leaving them with nothing but the ashes of their own ambition.
I grew up in a world of inherited privilege and carefully concealed decay in Newport, Rhode Island. The Davenport name was old money, synonymous with seaside mansions, yacht club memberships, and generations of influence. But that was the story. The reality was a different matter. The great fortune had been diluted over generations, and my parents were masters of illusion, projecting an image of effortless wealth while privately scrambling to keep the creditors at bay. Our sprawling seaside mansion, a testament to a bygone era, was a beautiful facade hiding a foundation of debt and quiet desperation. Their greatest fear wasn't poverty itself, but the public humiliation of being exposed as newly poor. My passion, from a very young age, was their greatest and most public disappointment. I loved history. Not the sanitized, high society version discussed at galas, but the real, tangible grit of it. I found my joy in dusty archives, in the faded ink of centuries-old letters, in the quiet solitude of the local historical society where I volunteered every summer. I once found an 18th century sea captain's log in our attic and spent an entire summer painstakingly deciphering its water-damaged pages, mapping its voyages. When I proudly showed my mother, Eleanor, my work, she barely glanced at it, remarking that it was a shame I was wasting a beautiful summer on dusty papers, when I could be at sailing camp networking with the sons of her influential friends. My dream was to pursue a PhD and become a university archivist, a curator of stories. To my parents, this was a profoundly embarrassing ambition. My mother would lament to her friends that she didn't know where my peculiar interests came from. My father, Richard, was gentler, but his disappointment was just as clear. He would explain that my duty, as the sole Davenport heir, was to secure the family's future through a strategic alliance, a marriage. My dusty, useless hobby, as he called it, was a liability in that pursuit. As their financial situation grew more precarious, I overheard hushed arguments about selling off a parcel of land or letting the longtime gardener go. Their project to mold me into the perfect high society wife intensified. Life became a series of lessons, etiquette classes where an instructor hired by my mother would rap my knuckles for incorrect fork placement, art appreciation seminars focused not on the art, but on the artists favored by the ultra-wealthy, intensive French lessons, not for the love of the language, but because it was deemed a prerequisite for a woman of a certain class. My mother curated my wardrobe, my bookshelf, even my opinions, all in service of creating a product she could bring to market. When I was 22, they identified their target. Alistair Sterling was a legendary tech billionaire who had made his fortune in the early 90s and had since become a recluse. He was known for two things:
his immense, untouchable wealth, and his obsessive passion for collecting historical artifacts. He was the ultimate prize, and my parents became fixated on him. They used a distant family connection to arrange an introduction, and from that moment on, my life was no longer my own. It became a 2-year intensive training program designed to make me the perfect wife for a man I had never met. They researched his known interests with the precision of corporate spies, forcing me to become a conversational expert on subjects they thought would appeal to him, all while systematically devaluing the genuine historical passion that was already within me. Our first meeting was not at a ball or a charity gala, but in the sterile, climate-controlled quiet of a university's rare book archive. My parents had orchestrated it perfectly. Aloster was not what I expected. He was tall, lean, with piercingly intelligent eyes that seemed to bypass the expensive dress and perfect pearls that my mother had chosen for me, looking instead for something deeper. He didn't offer pleasantries. He gestured to a medieval manuscript laid out on a table and immediately began quizzing me, asking me to identify the script, to discuss the political context of its creation. For an hour, he tested me, his questions moving rapidly from Renaissance art to Byzantine economics to the chemical composition of 16th century ink. It was the most bizarre and yet the most intellectually stimulating conversation I had ever had. My parents, who waited anxiously outside, were ecstatic. They interpreted his eccentric interrogation as a sign of profound interest. I felt like I had just completed the strangest job interview of my life. Our courtship continued this way for a full year. We met in museums after hours, in the back rooms of elite auction houses, and in the quiet of his own breathtakingly vast library. He never once touched my hand, never offered a single personal compliment. Our relationship was a series of intense intellectual spars. Despite my resentment for the situation, I found myself drawn to his mind. For the first time, an adult, a brilliant man, was engaging with my intellect and taking my knowledge seriously. This created a confusing turmoil within me. I despised the transactional nature of it all, yet I was undeniably fascinated by him. One afternoon, he invited me to his estate. He led me to his private library, a soaring 2-story room that was less a library and more a museum. It was filled with priceless art and artifacts. But in the center of the room, on a simple wooden table, was a collection of unassuming, dusty letters. While my parents would have gravitated toward the Renoirs on the wall, I was immediately drawn to the letters. I recognized the handwriting from my studies as belonging to a little-known 17th century female astronomer. Aloster watched me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, as I completely ignored the multi-million-dollar paintings and spent the next hour absorbed in these forgotten documents. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment my fate was sealed.
Meanwhile, my parents were deep in negotiations with Alistair's legal team. They spoke openly in front of me about the Davenport Sterling Family Fund, the massive financial settlement Alistair would provide upon our marriage. They showed me the contracts, their hand trembling with excitement as they pointed out clauses detailing the transfer of stocks and capital. My father, with tears of relief in his eyes, told me I was single-handedly saving the Davenport legacy. When I tried, one last time, to express my deep misgivings about marrying a man I didn't love, my mother told me that love was a luxury for the poor. Our duty was to our name. Alistair's proposal was as unconventional as our courtship. A formal letter delivered by his lawyer. My parents celebrated as if they'd won the lottery. They conveniently brushed aside the one peculiar detail. The final addendum to the financial agreement, the document that would trigger the 9-figure payout, had to be signed by me alone, after the wedding ceremony. My father dismissed it as a billionaire's eccentricity. I felt a cold dread, but I was caught in a gilded trap of my own family's making. I saw no way out. The wedding day was a grotesque theater of wealth, entirely funded by Alistair. It took place on the grounds of his clifftop estate, a masterpiece of glass and stone overlooking the Atlantic. Hundreds of guests from the highest echelons of global society were in attendance. My parents were the stars of the show, floating through the crowd, accepting congratulations, their faces glowing with the thrill of their impending payday. I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, a ghost in a designer gown, feeling utterly detached from the scene around me. Alistair waited at the altar, looking not like a loving groom, but like a CEO about to finalize a major acquisition. The ceremony was brief, elegant, and devoid of any real emotion. After we were pronounced husband and wife, a small party of us, my parents, Alistair, and his team of lawyers were ushered into his vast, two-story library for the official signing. My mother was practically vibrating with excitement, her eyes darting around the room as if she were already redecorating it. The lead lawyer, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, placed a single, elegant document, bound in leather, in front of me. This was the addendum. My father smiled and handed me a beautiful, antique fountain pen, telling me that this was the final, wonderful step to securing our family's future for generations to come. I took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and leather filling my lungs, and began to read. My parents watched me, their triumphant smiles frozen on their faces. As my eyes moved down the page, my own expression began to shift. The legal jargon was dense, but the meaning was starting to crystallize. This was not a financial document. It was a letter of appointment. It stated in no uncertain terms that the preceding marriage ceremony was a non-traditional integrity and aptitude test designed to identify a worthy successor. It went on to officially appoint me, Isabel Davenport, as the founding president of the newly established Sterling Historical Foundation. It granted me an annual operating budget of $50 million, a personal salary of $5 million a year, and complete, autonomous curatorial control over Alistair Sterling's entire private collection of art, artifacts, and historical documents, one of the most valuable private collections on the planet. My hands began to shake as I read the final, devastating clause. It specified that because this union was in fact an employment contract appointing me to a position of immense responsibility and financial independence, all prior financial agreements negotiated with third parties, namely my parents, Eleanor and Richard Davenport, were hereby rendered null and void. The document elaborated that any attempt to leverage a personal relationship for financial gain demonstrated a character flaw that was fundamentally at odds with the Foundation's mission of preserving history for knowledge's sake, not for profit. The money, the stocks, the Davenport Sterling Fund, it had all vanished into thin air. I looked up from the page, my heart pounding, and met Alistair's intense gaze. For the very first time, he smiled at me, a genuine, warm, and deeply respectful smile. He began to speak, his voice calm and clear, loud enough for my parents to hear every word. He explained that he had spent the last decade searching for someone with a true, incorruptible passion for history to entrust with his life's work. He said he was never looking for a young wife. He was looking for an heir to his intellectual legacy. He looked directly at my parents, his expression hardening. He told them that their transparent, disgusting attempt to sell their own daughter to him had almost disqualified me. But then he said he met me. He recounted the moment in his library when I had ignored priceless paintings to pore over the letters of a forgotten astronomer. He said in that moment, he knew he had found the one person whose love for history was as pure as his own. The very passion my parents had spent years trying to extinguish was the one quality he valued above all else. The sound that escaped my mother's throat was a strangled gasp. My father simply stared at the document, his face ashen as the full magnitude of his miscalculation crashed down upon him. They had schemed and manipulated for years, counting on a 9-figure payday. Instead, they had succeeded only in personally delivering their unwanted daughter to a position of unimaginable power and wealth, a fortune they could never, ever touch. The immediate aftermath was a spectacular implosion. My mother began shouting, her carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. She called it a trick, a fraud, a betrayal. My father was silent, a statue of a broken man. Alistair's security team, materializing as if from nowhere, politely but firmly escorted my parents off the property, away from the wedding guests who were now beginning to murmur and stare. The great Davenport Sterling deal was over. They had arrived as the architects of a dynasty and left with nothing but their own profound and very public humiliation. My marriage to Alistair was, as the addendum had stated, unconventional. We became formidable professional partners, and over time, the deepest of friends. Our relationship was a meeting of minds, built on a shared passion for preserving the past. I moved into a private residence on the estate grounds and took the helm of the Sterling Foundation. For the first time in my life, I was utterly and completely free. I poured my heart and soul into the work, traveling the world, acquiring artifacts for the collection, funding archaeological digs, and building a world-class digital archive that made historical documents accessible to scholars and students everywhere. I was living the exact life I had always dreamed of, the life my parents had told me was a worthless fantasy. They tried to contact me, of course. First came the furious, threatening letters from my mother's lawyers, which my new, very high-powered legal team dismissed with ease. Then came the desperate, pleading voicemails from my father filled with regret and self-pity. I didn't respond. My revenge wasn't about engaging with their drama. It was the quiet, resounding finality of my new life. It was the satisfaction of proving that the passion they had devalued was in fact priceless. A year later, I saw a small article in a financial paper. The Davenport estate in Newport had been sold at auction to cover outstanding debts. They had lost everything. They had tried to sell me to a billionaire, only to discover that in his world, I was the priceless asset, and their greed was a liability he had expertly and ruthlessly eliminated. The ultimate lesson I learned was not about wealth or revenge, but about value. My parents only understood price. They saw me, their daughter, and put a price on me. They saw history and art and saw only their auction value. They never understood true worth, the worth of passion, of integrity, of knowledge. Alistair, for all his eccentricity, understood it perfectly. My revenge was simply in becoming the woman he and I knew I could be. I had found my place, not by marrying into a legacy, but by being chosen to build one. What is a passion of yours that others have underestimated? Share your story in the comments below. If this story of poetic justice resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thank you for listening, and always remember to honor the things that make you who you are, for they are truly priceless.